Fantastic. All right. Good morning, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about towards a business-friendly regulatory regime, and we are having this conversation with fairly good reason, and that is because at the moment a lot of evening and nighttime economy venues are genuinely fighting for their survival. Things are tough, and it's not just one thing. It feels like it's everything coming at them all at once. So firstly, just as a bit of context, as social businesses, as businesses that generally tend to bring people together, they are often, and it's not necessarily a gripe, but it's just the way it was, both for the UK and Ireland, the first types of businesses to close, and often the last to be allowed to fully reopen throughout the pandemic. And that means they had specific challenges around their financial resilience. You know, many other sectors on the high street were able to trade in one way or the other, using logistics, using online tools. But for a social business, if you're in the business of bringing people together, there's very little ways to make an income during COVID. And that disruption to opening and closing, along with the challenges of long COVID, and along this one for the UK specifically, issues around Brexit for a sector which was heavily reliant on workers across the EU. We're feeling the legacy of that, and that is a lot of shortages across the industry in terms of labour. Not least the UK hospitality sector, which is reported to have lost around 200,000 overseas workers. So that's just overseas workers. And given we got shortages, it appears, in many sectors, while these are social businesses, quite often for the evening and nighttime economy, they are unsociable hours. So the evening and nighttime economy is struggling with staffing as a result, as people are able to go to other sectors. It's a similar story in Ireland as well, where the tourism body has done its barometer and found that 87% of hospitality businesses are still finding it difficult to recruit staff, and 71% have had to increase pay in order to bring people in. There is, of course, the issue of inflation and the cost of living crisis. So things like food and drink, for example, are soaring. Food prices going up to a 14-year high. It's been very recently reported, with the pace of the rise being the fastest since 2008, when we had the Great Recession, partly down to the challenges of the invasion of Ukraine. And it's pushing UK inflation up. So we are hovering just below 10% at the moment, and it is forecast to get worse. And again, fairly similar case in Ireland. If anything, for Ireland, the situation is a little bit better than the EU average. So EU average at the moment is 9.6% in terms of inflation. For Ireland, it's 8.9%, which is slightly down on previously, where it had hit a record high of 9.1%. So good news for Ireland in the fact that they've had a small fall in inflation. And then we got challenges around energy, of course, and this feels like the straw that will break the camel's back. So we are hearing of some crazy prices being quoted for a wide range of evening and nighttime businesses. Sky News reporting that there was one business that had been quoted 1,400% increase in energy. And unfortunately, it's not unheard of across the industry. I have heard of businesses being quoted 1,000% increases in energy. I'm hearing of businesses being quoted tens of thousands of pounds just in terms of their standing charge. So that's before they even switch on the lights. They're being asked to find over £10,000 in terms of their energy bills. It's not sustainable. It's simply not sustainable. And it's not just the UK either. It is also in Ireland, where there are warnings that the doubling, sometimes tripling of energy costs will just simply be the end of hundreds of nighttime economy businesses in Ireland, including pubs who are worried. There are concerns that in Cork alone, in the Cork region alone, the loss of around 300 pubs this particular article relates to. And to make matters worse, all of these inflationary pressures at the same time impact households directly. And what that does is that erodes discretionary spend, and that means a big squeeze for businesses. So at the moment, we have a fall in real terms pay for people. So while wages in the UK rose by 4.7% between April and June, it was outpriced by inflation. So real value meant that pay during that period fell by 3%, according to the Office for National Statistics. And that's between April and June. We know things are forecast to get worse. So businesses are facing a massive squeeze. And the thing about discretionary income is about those things which are not a necessity. And for many people, it's about getting the utilities paid, housing costs paid, being able to put food on the table. Things like going to the pub, going to restaurants, going to nightclubs. They are things we want to do. They are nice to do's, but they're not essentials. And so that's where the real squeeze when it comes to discretionary pay will fall. And we think we're already seeing that impact. So throughout the year, we've heard some really concerning stats about the loss of businesses from a number of sectors, including hospitality and leisure. This particularly worrying article that pubs in England and Wales are at record low levels, based on research going back to the mid-70s. So we've dropped below 40,000 pubs across England and Wales in the past couple of months. So there are definitely real challenges out there. So the question is how can we help? What can we do? We know we can't directly influence things like energy costs or food inflation. So what support can we put in place that will make life a little bit easier for businesses? And certainly one thing I know from my time on the Hospitality Sector Council in the UK, one of the things we've discussed is how the trading environment isn't always as easy as it could be for hospitality sector and others operating in the same space as well. And one thing the pandemic has shown us is that when there is a crisis, we can move heaven and earth to make life a little bit easier for those businesses in pain. And for me, we are still in a crisis. So even though we have no direct impact on some of the big geopolitical things happening at the moment, we can make local trading easier for those businesses. Ireland is trying to make a start. So certainly our Irish members will recognise that there is reform coming for the alcohol licensing laws. So late last year, a consultation came out from the Justice Minister, Helen McEntee, who's looking to take forward this reform and wanted to consult with the industry. And the aim of this reform is to deliver a single act consolidating more than 100 different pieces of legislation dating all the way back to 1833. And just to make life a lot easier for businesses, remove some loopholes, which are a bit of a challenge, remove some of the complexity there is around alcohol licensing for Irish businesses. So we're waiting to see really the substance, the details of the reform following the consultation. So we'll make sure we'll keep our members involved in that conversation as things move forward, and maybe it's something we will discuss more when we are in Cork next month for the Purple Flag Awards. Certainly in the UK, one of the things which has been made obvious to me again and again and again by a number of businesses is the amount of fragmentation we have from various stakeholders who are involved in the governance of the evening and nighttime economy space, everyone from policing, licensing, planning and highways. And the fact that it can be a real challenge for businesses to jump a number of hoops, because sometimes these functions, they've not been designed to be business friendly. They've not been designed with businesses in mind. And so sometimes there can be duplication, there can be unnecessary barriers in terms of businesses being able to see how they can change the way they trade. Can we change this? Can we create a more business friendly environment? And another thing as well, just in terms of the regulatory system at the moment, we might have a real emerging problem with high street homes. On the one hand, we've got a housing supply crisis. On the other hand, we know we've got an evening and nighttime economy, which is low on resilience. And those things coming together might mean a little bit of conflict, especially in terms of new homes being moved into urban centres and then residents complaining about noise pollution. One of the things we're hearing is that people have been continually moving into homes in towns and city centres throughout the pandemic when the evening and nighttime economy was shut, and have been surprised to find that, yes, there is an evening and nighttime economy there when businesses have reopened. And this has been cause for a number of noise complaints, and these noise complaints can put businesses at risk, even though they may have been there first, even though they may have been there for a number of decades. This is a real challenge. It's made more difficult in England because of planning deregulation through permitted development rights as well. So there is a real challenge there. So with so much on their plate, how can we start to make a more efficient and user-friendly regulatory regime for our nighttime economy? So to help us have this discussion, I'm delighted to welcome Sylvia Oates from 6 Till 6, who's been doing some work with the GLA. So Sylvia, welcome. Do you want to tell us all about the project, why the project came about, and some of the things you've been learning?
Hi AJ, thank you so much for having me along today. I've also got Ali Turnham on the call, who was, we did this piece of work in partnership. So as and when, I will pull Ali in to sort of add some comment as well. I also have to apologise because my internet seems to be a little bit patchy, and so if I at any point dip out, it's literally for seconds and I should be back in again. But hopefully Ali can switch on his microphone and jump in if necessary. So good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for coming along today. I have done the dangerous step of preparing a PowerPoint. So shall we see if we can see that? Does that is that
yeah,
show?
Good luck with that. Yeah, it looks like it's coming up fine. If you want to hit the what, there we go. Perfect.
There we are. Perfect.
Great.
Okay, great. Right. So yeah, so as OJ said, it's a piece of work that we were commissioned to do through the Greater London Authority. We started this piece of work in January, and the remit was, I'll come on to the specifics of it, but it was just to identify business-friendly licensing and regulation projects that had been carried out or that had the potential to start and to support the recovery of the high street. And I thought to start with, I'll just explain that the team that we had on this project was 6 Till 6, which is my company, and Make Associates, who you'll be familiar with, is Ali Turnham's company. We came together to work on this, to bring our expertise together. So Ali and I, our companies, we specialise in licensing, regulation, nighttime economy. We write nighttime economy strategies, and we work with local authorities and businesses and police and bids, and all sorts of entities that have an interest in licensing a nighttime economy, to sort of advise on how to grow a safe, sustainable, welcoming, successful leisure economy, I like to call it, because obviously it's not just nighttime, is it, that these businesses are open. So we'll work with the GLA, but we also brought in some colleagues. So David Lucas, who some of you may know, is a licensing specialist. He's been a alcohol and gambling licensing specialist for longer than he would care to disclose, I am sure. Very pragmatic and very business friendly. So he was also the chair of the Nottingham Bid when I was the chief exec of Nottingham Bid, and at that time we were the only bid in the country to have a membership that just comprised of licensed premises. So he's very much focused on partnership working and in trying to find sort of pragmatic and middle ground solutions to allow local authorities to still, you know, perform their role as a regulatory service, but then also permit, you know, businesses to operate as freely as possible to you know, to have the most financial gain and business impact, I suppose, which is obviously very, very important based on OJ's excellent introduction and overview of what's happening in the sector. So we had David on the project, and we also were supported by Lorna Westwood and Isaac Heatley, who provided very fantastic sort of research and interview support for us as well. Oh, next slide, there we go. So project overview. So following COVID, London introduced the London Recovery Programme, and London councils launched its Pledges for Business, which was a long list of ways that the London councils believed would help businesses to recover from their pandemic. And within that sort of suite of desires and actions was an objective to provide business-friendly licensing and regulation, and that was kind of housed and couched in this desire to help the evening and nighttime economy to recover. When they started digging into these pledges for business, they thought, actually, what do we really mean by business-friendly licensing and regulation? And that's why this project came about. It was to really understand, what does that look like? What kind of things really help businesses? What makes the biggest difference? And what's currently happening out there that could be shared across London to, you know, to enable local authorities to take this more proactive and business-friendly approach to licensing and regulation. So that's why the GLA commissioned us to do this piece of research. And it was all around how to support the high street to recover. So it was very much to do with businesses that were open, primarily at night, but also, like I say, in the day, we'd sort of say to them that, you know, obviously the leisure economy covers day and night, but it was specifically businesses that required, you know, permission to operate through, you know, licensing, and that were subject to regulatory services. So it was alcohol licensing, primarily environmental health and trading standards. So it was those three regimes that we were interested in exploring. Might not surprise you to learn that most of the examples that we got were from licensing, but there were some innovations, as we'll come on to in a moment, to do with trading standards and environmental health as well. This research was quite a big piece of work through January to March, and we did lots of one-to-one interviews with 25 different local authorities in London. So there are 33, and we managed to speak to 25 of them, which we thought was very good. And we also spoke to 31 different operators, businesses, trade associations, government departments, police representatives, and other stakeholders like that. So it's quite an extensive piece of interview and research work. We also looked at, you know, statement of licensing policies and other documentation that supported this work as well. So what we thought we'd do is thought we'd give a bit of an overview of our findings, and we put those into different sort of categorical themes, because that's the way we like to sort of structure our reports. We find it really helps sharpen and give a, you know, a bit of a breadth of an overview of what we've found, but then dig into the details. So we have identified a number of themes that we saw coming through with the work and the projects that were delivered. So I'm going to go through some of those, and then we also have a slide which talks about some kind of national changes that would be needed to facilitate this, you know, more supportive, business supportive approach to licensing regulation, because, as you will be aware, local authorities and businesses have to operate under the Licensing Act, which is obviously set nationally, and so actually some of the things that they might want to do are not actually possible because of the Licensing Act, so or other legislation. So we also identified as one of our themes kind of the national picture that would need to change to to support this work. So we've got the themes that we identified, and I'll go through some examples from those, the national changes that would need to be made, and then towards the end I've also got some sort of general observations, I guess, from us doing this project, and some things to think about going forward, because we didn't necessarily include in the report, but it just might be interesting takeaways for you, or might be interesting discussion points after this presentation. Just OJ, quickly, how long have I got? Just go. Is it 10-15 minutes?
You've got as long as you need. Oh, no rush.
Okay, so we'll be here till 2 o'clock now. Okay. Ali, have you got anything to chip in at this point, or shall I crack on with theme one?
No, well, I was just going to say, yeah, we looked at around the world for examples, right? So yes, it's a London-based thing for the GLA and London councils, but I think it's particularly important to say that many of these lessons are universal, right? So some of the technical elements of perhaps a licensing regulation might be different in Ireland, might be different in Australia, where we drew some examples from, but actually many of them are about an attitude, an aptitude to change, and some of the things that you and OJ were saying in terms of how being under those pressures forces people to do things that perhaps they should have been doing 10 or 15 years ago. So the lessons are relevant no matter where you come from, really. It's not a London specific thing.
And Sylvia, just to jump in on the issue of those asks and things in the UK and the devolved nations, which might need to change in order to facilitate some of this. The Department for Business, the hospitality team at the Department for Business has got a watching brief on this meeting. So they're actually meant to attend today, but obviously because of the Queen's passing and the guidance for civil servants to not be involved in external meetings means that they will catch up following feedback. If there are specific asks in there, do let them be known, because the department is looking closely at what it can do to support the sector.
Thank you, OJ. And actually, that's a really good point, that one of the outcomes of this project was to provide a list of asks to the GLA that could be fed back through the Mayor's office to government. So I think some of that work is being done, but actually there's many voices that can be saying the same thing are useful. So if following this presentation you want us to put some information together for you, OJ, then really happy to do that, because I know you've got links in all over government, so that would be really helpful as well. Great. Okay, so the first theme that we have is innovating with public space and alfresco dining. So this was a very, as you can imagine, was a very common innovation and a very common way that we found local authorities were being innovative through supporting businesses through COVID, for obvious reasons. Obviously, we had the outdoor dining phenomenon, which has kind of catapulted the alfresco phenomenon that we were hoping to see, oh God, what, 15, 20 years ago, sort of come, you know, it accelerated that much more than any other phenomenon, I think, or any other event in recent past. So that's good news, I think, for most people. There's obviously some pros and cons, but we saw some really great work in this. And I should also mention we had a launch event and a culmination event for this project, and we had some of the best practices that we identified. We had people come and present at those events to actually talk through the project. So what I'll do is I'll send the project report to OJ afterwards, and perhaps if he wants to send it out to the participants on the call. But within there, we've actually included some clips of or some links to the YouTube clips where these people spoke about their projects and brought them to life and gives you a bit more flavour of exactly how they deliver these initiatives. So it's worth having a look at those. So there's people like a chap from Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea talking about their pavement licensing projects. They're each about 5-10 minutes, but they're really well worth a watch. We've got Rachel Pye from City of London, who is just a very inspiring regulatory services manager, talking about how they've taken a business-friendly approach to recovery. So things like that are within there. As I say, they're hyperlinked from the report, so it might be worth having a look at those if it's of particular interest to you. So I'll just pick out a couple of examples in here, because yeah, obviously I don't want to be keeping you till lunchtime. But I mentioned Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. They very much before it was even announced by government, started putting together their alfresco dining policy and identified pockets of land that they could use for outdoor dining, and they looked at exactly what they needed to do to facilitate outdoor dining. And it wasn't just from a point of the legislation and, you know, all the kind of box ticking, I suppose, but it was also thinking about, okay, we have a number of residents that tend to be pretty noisy, as in pretty vocal when it comes to if they have any, you know, challenges and problems with noise, or you know, things out on the street not being as they would like them to be. So if we're going to facilitate outdoor dining, what could those complaints be and how can we mitigate those? So they did things like they thought about the timing of rubbish and cleansing collections, and whether or not they could look at, reducing the noise, so asking them to turn off, the reversing beeps and those kinds of things. So they really thought about the holistic picture of when we introduce this service, this on-street dining element to Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, how can we make that as painless and as complaintless as possible in our borough? And so there's a really good, I'll say, a really good case study that you can click on and watch to see how they actually implemented that. So that was a really, really good and innovative pavement licensing implementation. And they were very, very kind of granularly supportive of each and every business to go and see exactly what their operation was like, and they would give them really good advice about things like, yes, you can't serve alcohol from, actually, yes, you can set up a booth out there, but you can't serve alcohol from it unless you get it licensed, etc., etc. So they really helped to be proactive to support businesses to get it right from the get-go, so that there were no kind of gotcha moments as they went along the path. And there was no sort of, it reduced any need for any sort of action in terms of picking people up for not doing things as in accordance with the law. So that was a really business friendly approach to getting that set up. We also saw a really nice example in Croydon, actually, where their approach to pavement licensing was very collaborative with the businesses, with the bid, with the local authorities, so, and actually different departments of the local authorities. So it wasn't just sort of licensing and highways that looked at that, but they also got the kind of the arts and culture team involved, and they put art installations into the outdoor areas. The bid provided the SIA security for the outdoor areas, and then obviously the businesses were given the opportunity, but then I think they paid for the outdoor furniture. So it was a really collaborative and nice example of implementing pavement licensing. Ali, do you have anything to add to Innovation One?
No, I think probably the most useful thing that I can add on that is and Kensington and Chelsea are one that have done it, but a number of them have, is how do you then build in the successes of that giant social experiment, urban experiment around outdoor dining? And the way that Kensington and Chelsea have done it is to look at including formal outdoor dining spaces and provisions in all of their neighbourhood local plans. So their town centre plans for places like Notting Hill, which didn't at the time they were being drafted have the level of provision for multifunctional usable spaces that could be used for events, local celebrations, and for local businesses to be able to put tables and chairs out. So they kind of formalized that through the planning process, which I think is really important. And there's other examples in there in the research of that as well, isn't there?
Yeah, thank you. Very useful. Great. Okay, so theme 2 was providing pre-application support. So obviously, the big operators that look to set up in an area have got an established team that know exactly what they're doing, know how to sort of roll out their business model in different local authorities, and can adapt and work very well to adhere to whatever the requirements are in that local authority. But if you're a new entrepreneur, sometimes it can all seem a bit of a minefield in terms of all the different permissions you might need, and the forms you have to fill out, and training you might need to get in place, and everything else. So we found that those local authorities that really were proactive in identifying those entrepreneurs that want to set up somewhere, and then signposted them in terms of exactly what they needed to do, and sort of handheld them through to opening up. They seemed to, they were very much valued by the independent operators that we interviewed as part of the project. And they made a real difference in terms of sometimes which borough a business might choose to set up in, depending on the experience they had through pre-application advice. And then again, also how successful that business was as it was sort of set up and launched. And it can save them a lot of money actually up front, because if a local authority is willing to give some pre-application support, it can reduce things like the amount of money that they need to spend with a licensing specialist and those sorts of things. So that that can be quite costly. And when you're setting up a one-man band or you know, a new enterprise, it can be, as we all know, rather a expensive exercise. So any money that you can save, but while still doing exactly what you need to do, is very valuable. A good example here was the Royal Borough of Greenwich. They engaged a specialist to provide environmental health and licensing startup advice. So Greenwich have tried to reinvigorate its markets offer in recent years, and so they particularly offered that support to businesses that wanted to go into the markets. But then they also had a kind of a scheme that sort of supported those that had started on the markets and were successful to then go into bricks and mortar. So Greenwich have worked with an enterprise called Startup in Local Libraries. I don't know if you've heard of that, but you can find some information on that online. And they used also some other kind of business support companies in the local area to, you know, to sort of kickstart those businesses into success. So yeah, that was a nice initiative. And then London Borough of Waltham Forest is quite a well-known example, but it's also a very good one. Through there, they were the nighttime enterprise zone pilot for the Greater London Authority. And as part of that pilot, they developed a toolkit that was a how-to guide for, you know, applying for an alcohol license, what you needed to do in relation to trading standards and environmental health, and also, you know, how to navigate the planning regime that you needed to if you wanted to set up a nighttime business. So that's actually available as an open source document online. So if you Google it, you'll be able to find it. If not, please do ask OJ, and I can send the link to that toolkit. And I do know there's a number of authorities that are looking to replicate that, and it's you know, I also know that Waltham Forest also to conversations with people that if they would like to find out a bit more about how they did it and what impact it's had locally. The other one that we do hear a lot of is local authorities that translate a lot of their forms and guidance and documentation into different languages, because particularly we found in London, but I know that's also true in lots of other conurbations around the country, that there, you know, there's some languages spoken very prominently in different areas, and it can be quite, I can imagine it would be quite daunting trying to navigate a kind of quite a formal legal document or legal process in not your native tongue. So that seems to be a very useful approach, if that's possible in your area. And just providing pre-application advice. Some authorities just do it as a matter of course, and they do it for free. Some charge for it, some don't do it at all. Obviously, you can imagine what order we put those in terms of how useful it is for business. But a lot of the local authorities that we spoke to that do provide advice said, well, it's a no-brainer for us, because actually it means we get a better quality of application. We're less likely to have to spend time kind of negotiating different conditions and changing people's applications and things. So actually it's a win-win for both parties. So yeah, we were hoping that through this research and through some of this, you know, communication of what we found, that might be a sort of approach that most local authorities will take, because it does seem to have benefits for both the applicant and the authority itself. Ali, do you have anything else to add to the providing pre-application support?
The one thing I would add is that there's quite a difference between the big players in the leisure, hospitality, nighttime economy market and the smaller players. So all the big players generally have very sophisticated licensing solicitors and consultants involved with them, who've got all of the systems set up to process applications, variations to applications, and that costs quite a lot of money, but it's very efficiently done and is generally very successful. Licensing authorities like that because it's everything they receive is nearly always spot on. But the vibrancy, entrepreneurs, new people coming to the market with ideas, often they don't have that access, both financially or resource wise or the experience, but they might have a great idea that's going to make a town or city centre more interesting. And so by providing that pre-application support, even if it's at a modest fee, for someone who's never done that before but has a great business idea, you've already just short-circuited a really important bit that they could spend hours doing. And our authorities that we researched said one of their biggest challenges internally is the amount of failed applications or applications that are put in and just don't meet the required spec. And that takes up a lot of officer time, as well as, you know, potentially just turning them down and saying, well, the computer says no. And most authorities we spoke to really don't want to do that. They want to support and help businesses. So the pre-app service, in whatever form it takes, is an incredibly important part of ensuring quality applications and success, and minimizing red tape for businesses.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good point, Ali. And the other thing that I thought of while you're talking is I know that one of the challenges that local authorities mentioned in providing the pre-application support was the officer time to do that, and the financial kind of weighing up the finances of being able to do that. But one of the examples on here, Cornwall Council, just in case it's helpful to anyone, they've actually created almost like a business model that it's self-funding in terms of the pre-application support. So yes, they apply for it, but it's also become a commercial service now, this the pre-application support that they provide. And it's not just to do with licensing, it's a bit more of a package behind it. So if your local authority, if you'd like to encourage your local authority to take this approach, but they don't currently, and they're worried about the financial impact, Cornwall Council is probably quite a good model to look at, because it hasn't created a financial burden for the authority. And I think, in fact, it actually creates a small income. So it's, again, a no-brainer. So yeah. Next one is getting creative with standard schemes. So I don't need to preach the inverted on this call, but there are lots of different standard schemes that are available. So things like Purple Flag, Ars Frangula, Best Bar None, Night Safety Charters, and all those different initiatives that can be put in place, community alcohol partnerships, and some of those great voluntary schemes. We found some great innovations in terms of how they were used to support businesses, and yeah, so some of the ones that we'd probably pull out as standout are London Borough of Harrow. If people on this call have not met Lou from Harrow, you should get in touch with her, because she's very, very she's inspirational as a woman. She's really focused on the ball, and very much you know, has taken time to really get to know her licensed trade community, and is very valued by them. Through COVID, the council in Harrow decided that actually they had got a bit of, it's a bit of an unusual situation, actually, because I normally find that if a pub watch is not supported necessarily by the local authority, that's when it starts to sort of decline a bit. But actually in Harrow, it was run by the local authority, and it started to become less popular with the businesses. And so the local authority spoke to the bid and said, look, can you help us? Will you take this on? And will you try and get us, you know, get the businesses re-engaged with pub watch and try and reinvigorate the scheme? And so Harrow bid embraced that, took on Best Bar None and Pub Watch, set up a WhatsApp group, and really kind of, you know, made sure that they pushed out, you know, regular messages with all the changing legislation through COVID, etc., and really kind of reinvigorated the Pub Watch scheme. They kept Best Bar None going through the pandemic, and what they actually did was they got venues to nominate each other to do with, you know, excellent practice through COVID, or, you know, best community outreach initiative, or those sorts of things. And they came up with some awards for things that they could award through COVID, because obviously a lot of the business as usual stuff that you would award through Best Bar None couldn't happen while people were closed. So it was about, look, what can we do with our Best Bar None scheme this year? And they still had a great award ceremony when they could, and just, yeah, kept those schemes alive and running through COVID. So it really provided, I think, a bit of encouragement to the businesses, but it also gave them that really useful two-way forum. The local authority was still involved, so when there was questions from the businesses about things like the ever-changing legislation and what wasn't permitted, the council were able to pick up on that really quickly and be really responsive. But yeah, involving the bid really helped to bring that conversation and that relationship to fore, so that was great. Another good example that we found here was Horsham District Council. So they developed a hospitality skills buffet, which had two objectives. It was to do with supporting the trade in terms of recruitment and retention, but then also increasing adherence to environmental health requirements. So they developed a sort of a skills program, and again, there's lots of information about this online, but they supported businesses in getting more staff through their doors and getting and you know and increasing and trying to address some of the staff shortage issues. But then at the same time, they made sure that those people that were appointed to those businesses were trained in terms of, you know, their requirements in responsible alcohol retailing and you know, adhering to environmental health requirements and things like that. So that's and it was a partnership with the local college. So that's a really great project if you wanted to have a look into that one. Ali, have you got anything to mention on the creative standard schemes?
Well, I think one of the things that we've picked up, not just in this work, Sylvia, but in some of our other joint projects and in our individual projects, is I think a frustration amongst some councils that feel they're really trying hard to support businesses, but participation is patchy, or the usual suspects, or there's a lack of motivation. And, you know, sure, I understand that because it's such a difficult trading environment, most difficult trading environment in the 30 years that I've been involved in the nighttime economy. So I understand that, you know, you're focusing on your business first and foremost, but you know, enlightened operators really understand they need to work together, need to work with the local agencies. And I suppose one of the things we did find was that there's a frustration with sometimes the quality of participation in the schemes. And I'm not sure we have any instant answers for that, Sylvia, but I thought it was worth flagging it up because I think they live or die on the quality of participation and engagement. And I think sometimes local authorities are getting frustrated because they then feel they have to sort of take over and be paternalistic sometimes. And I know it varies across every municipality and local authority. Some businesses might feel that they've got over-regulated or they're over paternalistic, and others are you know, this other end of the spectrum where we've not got enough business oomph in those meetings. Do you think there are solutions to that, Sylvia?
So are you talking about, for example, participation in some of these schemes by businesses following COVID and other challenges and you know, prioritization, perhaps needing to prioritize other things? Yeah, I think so, because when they work well, they work brilliantly, and that's what this slide shows in the case studies that we found. However, these are the sort of very best examples that we found. I know there are other great examples out there, but we also find a lot of the opposite side of the coin, don't we? Yeah, I think you're right. I think some standard schemes have fared better than others, and it'd be interesting to hear from OJ and Karen and Laura about Purple Flag and how that's, you know, and whether they've seen any change in engagement, I guess, through COVID and post-COVID in Purple Flag. I obviously, my company runs the Best Buy None scheme, and pre-COVID we had 40 schemes, and post-COVID we've got 56 Best Buy None schemes. And I think that's because during COVID we did a lot of work with local authorities and bids and different entities that might run a Best Buy None scheme to say, look, you know, coming out of the pandemic, this is a really useful mechanism to provide a supportive approach to ensuring that people are adhering to the Licensing Act and to their requirements and being good operators. So that message, I think, was heard and understood. But if I'm completely honest on this call, I wouldn't say that Best Buy None accreditation is the foremost kind of priority for a lot of businesses. And I know that I've got some long-standing schemes like Plymouth, for example, where some of their operators that have been part of the Best Buy None scheme for 5-10 years are saying, you know, just this year, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do it because it's just one more thing that I can't find time for. Some of them are still prioritizing it, but I would say probably the numbers of premises within each scheme is lower this time. We've got more schemes, but fewer premises within each scheme. And I think that's just that is just an impact of COVID and the sign of the times from, you know, all the other challenges that OJ mentioned at the start. And I think it's just, I hope that local authorities and bids will stick with the schemes, because I think what's a shame is then if they think, oh, we've only got, I don't know, 10 premises instead of 15 or 40 instead of 50 or whatever it is, because different sizes of towns and cities. I think it's useful to have that scheme there, because I think the businesses will come back to it, and they often sometimes still ask, even though they might not be accredited, they might go to the person that operates the scheme and say, you know, I know I'm not a Best Buy unaccredited this time, but, you know, I'm having a problem with my outdoor smoking area. Can you give me some advice or whatever? I think just having that constant and that support mechanism in place is useful. But I get your point that, yeah, it's a challenging time, I think, for standard schemes at the moment.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, AJ.
I would, you know, I think there's been changes across the piece here, and I think you can look at it in two ways. I don't think there's any area of the nighttime economy that has been static because of the pandemic. And for Purple Flag specifically, there is a lot of interest in taking forward Purple Flag. So we are seeing lots of interest from certain areas and growth overall in terms of the accreditation, which is great. But in other areas of the accreditation, it's difficult. And I think that's largely around skills, staffing and churn that's happened. That means there's some functions within Purple Flag that haven't operated as well as they would have done pre-pandemic. And the easiest example I can point to is assessors who are no longer in the same role that they once were. And there's been churn in areas like licensing in terms of different professions. So we haven't got the same amount of assessors that we used to. So we've had to go on a big assessor recruitment drive to give us the numbers to be able to fulfill Purple Flag again. And so it's, in one sense, there are positives, in another sense, there are negatives. And to come to Ali's point specifically on the challenges on getting businesses involved, and if this is important to this entire debate on how we support businesses through some challenging times, businesses aren't as responsive as they could be, and I think that's down to a lot of challenges around their staffing and making sure they have the right staff to have capacity to be able to look at things broader than just getting through the next day or the next week or getting through Christmas. And one example I can point to is ATCM was brought in to support the dissemination of a huge training program for consumer facing industries, not least tourism, visitor economy, hospitality sectors for the West Midlands in the run up to the Commonwealth Games. And this was funded by the Mayor of the West Midlands and the West Midlands Grove Company and People First. And the training looked fantastic. And it was everything from online stuff to podcasts, etc. All entirely free for businesses. And take-up was really poor. And I think take-up's been really poor because the staff just aren't there. The capacity just isn't there. And I think that's a massive challenge. That's a big barrier to a lot of the things we're discussing.
I think that's very astute observations, OJ. I think you're right. And actually, as you were talking, it made me think of something else. I think it was particularly in relation to Best Bar None. We're also seeing, and this is what I heard from what you were saying, is it's almost the model is slightly changing, and the reason why people are engaging and how they engage is slightly changing. So one example of that with Best Bar None is that in the past, I found that the national operators would always get involved in a local scheme. They would just do it, and it wasn't a box ticking exercise at all, but at the same time they just knew they would fly through it because all their managers knew exactly what they're doing. They met all the criteria, tick tick tick, done. All your Weatherspoons, all your M&Bs, all your Green Kings, etc. And it was made, so I always used to think the main benefit for Best Bar None was the independence, because actually that's the ones that we can give the template policies to. Those are the ones that we can coach through from not particularly passing in the first place to getting through, etc. That still holds in many ways. But the other thing what's happening now is I'm speaking to national operators, and they're saying actually some of the people that they've got managing or deputy managing their premises are not necessarily as experienced or perhaps as higher quality as they would like them to be. And so they've sort of started speaking to us about Best Bar None. How can we use Best Bar None nationally to help support to make sure that our operations are as responsible as we need them to be? Can that be almost like an independent check and a way of kind of supporting them to get there? So I think the nationals are looking at Best Bar None in a different way about how we can support them to get their teams that aren't as, they just had to sort of put people that are perhaps not quite as experienced as I'd like them to be in these posts, but how can we use Vespon as a kind of soft way to support them to get to where they need to be? So yeah, I think it's also about, you know, using standard schemes in different ways as well, and looking at what the opportunities are there to support what the specific challenges are in the sector. So that's been an interesting kind of development, I think, over the last year or two as well. Great. Theme 4, enhancing understanding and partnerships. So yeah, I think this is something that we used to always talk about a lot at Nottingham Bid when I was there, and I'm sure you have these conversations all the time, which is about, you know, how do we foster that really great partnership working between the local authorities, the police, the businesses. Obviously, we all have the same agenda. We all want a really safe and vibrant nighttime economy. And how do we, you know, get all of that working better together? So here's some examples of where we saw that working really well. The Institute of Licensing, you'll probably have come across before, because I know they're sort of a friend of Purple Flag, if you like, friend of the ATCM. There's a membership body for anybody involved in licensing, and it tends to have a lot of local authority licensing officers and police licensing officers involved. And they have an annual initiative where they do job shadowing. So we have seen things like licensing managers of local authorities go and work in venues, and you know, police licensing officers and things, sort of swapping job roles, and just getting a better understanding of you know, what it's like to be in that business, what it's like to operate within the regime, etc. So that's really interesting, and it's really opened some eyes. And when you hear those licensing officers sort of talk about their experiences, it's actually been quite an eye-opening experience for them. So I think it's June every year that they have a National Licensing Week, and that's when they encourage this job swap to happen. So it might be something that to keep an eye on and to think of as a bit of a you know, innovative approach to enhancing understanding. We also have an example there of City of London. I mentioned this earlier, that City of London was one of our case studies. So again, you can link to it from the document. But they engaged Philip Colvin, who many of you will know as well. Again, I think he's obviously used to be the chair of Purple Flag, I believe, a number of years ago. And he has developed training for the elected members so that they can understand better how a licensed premises operates. So obviously members might be on the licensing committee, but also members can make objections to licensing applications, and they often do. But sometimes that just comes from a resident's perspective, and it was about, actually, yes, we know that you're elected members, so you want to serve your residents, but we also have an obligation to the community and to the business community. And actually, this is, you know, these are all the things that businesses have to do before they even open their doors, if they are, you know, licensed under the alcohol licensing regime. And trying to really get those members to understand and to kind of, you know, sit more in those businesses' shoes to understand what it is that they do and how they try and mitigate their impact and work with their neighbours, etc. So we're seeing a bit more of that actually happening nowadays. And I think again, the Institute of Licensing has some member training, so it might be useful for your members to undertake that if they haven't done so locally. Another great example is from Sheffield, and again, I don't think Steve Lonier is on this call, but Steve Lonier is head of regulatory services, I believe, at Sheffield. That might not be his exact title, but he does oversee the regulatory function at Sheffield Council. And they've got a great piece of work going on at the moment, which is you know, doing a big package of business support under the licensing regime. But one of the things that he was talking about was, actually, our licensing officers, they work 9 till 5, and most of the businesses that they regulate operate, you know, post 6 o'clock, you know, not exclusively, but that's when they sort of experience more of their issues. So can we have a function where we're open in the evening and nighttime economy, so that if there are issues or that someone wants to talk to somebody at 10 o'clock at night, they can do. So they're starting to look at that as a model to see if that provides an easier way of businesses getting issues resolved or getting support when they need it. London Borough of Camden are developing a community improvement district, and I imagine that OJ may already know about this and is involved or has some further information, but we're keeping a close eye on that, because that's to do with bringing together local residents and businesses and trying to get them talking to each other at early stages without that then progressing to noise complaints and being dealt with through environmental health, etc. So it's just about trying to bring the community together and foster some common understanding. Coventry City Council is an example that everybody points to in terms of excellence in relation to planning and licensing working together. So I'm sure everybody on this call is very familiar with the challenges that the different regimes and the fact that they don't dovetail between each other presents to business. But Coventry has done as much as it possibly can to sort of overcome this by co-locating the planning and the licensing services. It means that there's just some really helpful conversations that happen through the pre-application and the application elements of people's business development. So that's been really helpful. Ali, you've probably got something to say about this one, I should imagine.
The only thing that I would add is go back to the training of members of councillors. It's true of all England and Wales, other devolved nations and the Republic, is the quality of knowledge and what you can do when you are granting licenses for businesses, the conditions you attach to them, the balance between encouraging businesses and growth and growing your evening and nighttime economy, and balancing residents' need for well-being, amenity, and sleep at times, and getting that context right is really difficult. And because elections happen in democracies, it's not like Russia, where we have the same person in charge for, well, maybe 40 years, who knows. We generally see really high churn in local councillors, even more so than MPs. And so they need to be retrained on a constant basis. And still, and I've been talking about this for 20 years, it's still really patchy between those authorities that constantly invest in training and helping councillors understand how businesses work and how their regulatory decisions impact upon the ability to trade effectively, even in normal times, let alone exceptional, difficult times, is still really patchy. And the Institute of Licensing is leading in England, Wales, and beyond. I don't know the situation in the Republic of Ireland, but there needs to be consistently more investment in training of councillors to understand how difficult it is to run a business and how they can help while still protecting and upholding the law.
Thanks, Ali. That's really interesting that as you were talking, it reminded me of one of the interviews that we had was with McDonald's, wasn't it? McDonald's, the national team. And they referenced the fact that under the old licensing regime, so pre-2003 Act, one of the requirements when going through a licensing application was that the members would actually go and do a site visit. So the licensing committee would go and do a site visit. So actually they would know what the premises was they were talking about when they were considering the application. I thought, gosh, that kind of is a bit, that brings a different perspective into it, doesn't it? Because when they're talking about things like service areas and the challenges and the deliveries and whatever else, they can actually picture that physical space. No requirement for that anymore. And McDonald's was saying, wouldn't that be great if some areas brought that back in? You can imagine resourcing would be a challenge there, but yeah, I could see why McDonald's were, because McDonald's often says that they put their applications in and they're kind of seen as this big bad operator, and but actually they do a lot of things off their own backs and very proactively and very innovatively to mitigate and reduce the impacts that they have on their neighbours, their environments, etc. And the guy was just saying, we just like the opportunity sometimes to just tell our story and to help the councillors to understand our business model. And so that's a really good point, Ali, that's because they can make or break an application, can't they? Okay, next point is facilitating new opportunities. So so obviously there's no better place to look at innovation, I always think, in the licensed trade. You always find operators that are developing new models and meeting the requirements of the market and the ever-changing needs and desires of our new 18-year-olds that are coming through, and having to work around the different market forces and challenges and things. They're very flexible and very innovative in terms of the different business models that they bring in, the different offerings that they put through their businesses. And so we were thinking about, well, actually, the operators need to be innovative. And sometimes that then translates into how can the local authorities respond to that and make sure that they are able to facilitate those developments and those changing requirements of the business. So we came across quite a few different examples of this. So it won't surprise you that some of the examples I'm talking about will be things like food delivery. So, you know, the big rise in Deliveroo and Just Eat and Uber Eats required, you know, some quick thinking and changes and flexibility. So an example there is London Borough of Waltham Forest. So one of the problems that we found through Uber Eats and Deliveroo, etc., is actually the changing nature of the high street to you know, with those additional food couriers on the street. So in London Borough of Waltham Forest in particular, there was one area, and I cannot remember which high street it was precisely, but they were finding that there was a big problem with couriers gathering around a kind of a bike rack and creating a lot of noise and nuisance. And also there's the issue of rest facilities and that sort of thing. So they're currently conducting a feasibility study, and they're hoping to provide a dedicated building for those food and drink couriers so that they can, you know, to remove the noise off street, makes a more pleasant street environment in the high street, and also provides that much needed sort of rest breaks. And I can't remember what they're called. I don't know if Ali does remember, but there was there's a number of buildings in London that were put in place back in, I think, the Victorian era, that were kind of coachmen's rest facilities, and they're sort of exploring reopening those. Is that right, Ali?
Yeah, there's they were called something like cabmen shelters, and there's 13 of them left. They're all listed. You can Google them, and they're all painted green. And they were I'd seen them around London. I didn't know what they were, and I was chastising myself for not being inquisitive enough. And they're quite small because they're from a Victorian era, and there were places where hackney carriage drivers could go and eat their sandwiches, get warm again, obviously in winter. And some of them had toilets attached to them, etc. So it was a place that hackney carriage drivers could go and you know, and chew the fat with their fellow hackney cab drivers. And there's 13 left, but the GLA and King's College London and a couple of other partners, maybe the LSE design people, are looking at a pilot to do a new one in Waltham Forest. I don't know current status on that. But the idea is to build a building which would house those workers, and they can just drop off and go to the toilet and, you know, receive information. You know, often those gig economy workers are not particularly well looked after. So it would serve a number of functions, really. But it's an interesting, you know, element of how our cities are changing, and, you know, we want to facilitate businesses to be able to survive, and through pandemic, you know, as we saw in some of our night audits, Sylvia, you know, the way they were surviving was by, you know, pivoting to takeaway, and that saved their business, right? So we want to support them, but also it's for some of those bigger companies to start investing in those sorts of facilities as well. It shouldn't just be local authorities trying to support the workers of hugely successful and well-backed companies, you know.
Yeah, this is the thing, isn't it? It's difficult because the other thing we found is that obviously with Uber and Just Eats and Deliveroo, there's challenges there in terms of the drivers not being employed by those companies. So where they cause issues, the local authorities sometimes are thinking, well, we can't pin this on those operators, but what we do is we do license McDonald's, Burger King, etc. for any food served after 11, so we can make it their problem. So it's also, that's a very complex and challenging sort of picture, because then you're getting some of those operators going, well, hang on a minute, if you're going to do that to us, we'll get off the high street and we'll go and set up in a business park outside the city centre. So I think that will be an interesting picture to keep under observation going forward, because yeah, I believe there needs to be a mechanism to sort of to bring those food delivery companies more into sort of accountability. And I know some people like Uber Eats, not Uber Eats, Just Eat are looking at an employment model now, aren't they, which sort of changes the story a little bit and the opportunities. But I think that's a really good one to keep under observation, to make sure that yeah, we put the responsibility with the right people, and we come together as a partnership and get that sorted in a pragmatic way. The other one is that I want to just quickly highlight, and I know that the time is marching on, so I won't spend too long on it, but London Borough of Hillingdon, they noticed that they were getting a lot of applications for businesses that retailed alcohol from the home, so sort of home delivery, and also that delivered to the home. And so what they did was they looked at how they structured those applications and what conditions they put on those licenses. And then when they were getting further applications in through the door, they were then using those learnings to support those businesses to start up. But they also gave them, where the first few that came through the door, they really took some time to understand their business model and some of the other things that they'd put in place, and they passed that learning on to the subsequent applications. So they sort of tried to sort of share best practice with them. So I thought that was a really nice example there as well. Okay, reducing cost and time burdens. I think this is quite a big this is quite a big one. That when we spoke to most of the operators, they said, look, making things quicker and less of a burden, if we can just tick those two boxes, that actually is massive for us, because time is money, time is cost. Time is delaying is a really big factor for us. So some of the things that we found there were enabling people to make applications online. So London Borough of Kingston are quite unusual in that they're a Google authority, they're not a Microsoft authority. They use Google Forms to facilitate online applications. London Borough of Hackney has developed an open markets platform, which actually I'll hand over to Ali because he's better at explaining this one.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. It's so from an evening and nighttime economy hospitality perspective, some of London's markets obviously open into the evening, particularly in areas with big ethnic minority, and an incredibly important part of the vibrancy and sustainability of not just those markets in and of themselves as fee generators for local authorities, their cultural and importance, their food importance in terms of places where there might be a food desert in terms of quality food. There's so many reasons that markets are amazing, and those that are open into the evening rather than specifically sort of entertainment night markets or destination night markets. So what Hackney have done, and they're leading a project for the mayor, is to create a platform which will allow traders to meet with markets operators. Currently there's 6 other authorities, including Hackney, who are piloting it. And what they're doing is taking all of their markets, digitizing them, and you will, once you've agreed with your one authority, your food regulatory compliance certificates, environmental health, that will allow you to trade across all of them, because you used to have to fill out separate forms. You'll also be able to see where there's vacancies to trade in all those different 7 locations and book in, see the prices of pitches. And there's probably 4 or 5 other benefits in terms of digitizing that and then allowing people to go across boroughs. And it's really important, because there's no way you're going to risk trying to trade in your neighboring borough if you have to fill out huge amounts of bureaucracy and red tape just to give it a go. What you want to be able to do is just book in, give it a go, see if it works for you, try somewhere else. Your offer might be brilliant in 1 of 5 different locations, but you've got to try them, but nobody's going to fill out 5 sets of paperwork to do that. So that's going forward. And I think it's a really interesting proposition in terms of using technology to make things easier. Is it going to work everywhere? I don't know, but certainly in bigger conurbations where you've got multiple local authorities with regulatory regimes, it could be a really good model.
Thanks, Ali. And then just some really simple ones, like I spoke to Edward King at London Borough of Newham, who's quite new in post there as head of licensing, and he just said, look, I came into this authority, and actually I was finding that a lot of applications were going through to committee hearings, which is time and cost for us, time and cost for the applicant. So actually, when applications came in, I would say, what, actually, if you had these conditions, we wouldn't necessarily have a problem with it. So it's having those conversations which prevented the need to go to the expense of a committee hearing. So just those pragmatic approaches to try and reduce cost for business and for the local authority, again, a win-win really. And another example there, which was found across a number of authorities, was just things like, allowing informal plans changes rather than applications, and just taking those steps of, is this a does this have to be a full variation? Can it be a minor variation? So just really thinking about how can it's that local authority mind shift of making things as easy as possible for them and for the businesses, but within obviously that robust retaining the upholding the Licensing Act, of course, as well. Developing policies to support business. There's several examples of this. So things like, I mean, obviously, you'll all know that when businesses apply in different local authorities, they have to obviously consult with the statement of licensing policy in that area and adhere to the requirements within that. So I know through COVID and post-COVID, a lot of local authorities have had their statement of licensing policies come up for review and renewal. And we've seen a few that have really taken a very pragmatic approach to look at, how do we reduce burdens? How do we provide as much support as possible through our statement of licensing policy? How do we make it quite permissive? That was a word that City of London used when they put their new licensing policy in place. But we've also I've seen some areas, for example, Colchester, where they've renewed their existing statement of licensing policy as a kind of almost like a holding page to say, we had to renew it because it was 5 years old, but we've renewed it through COVID as was, with the intention that once the chips have landed and we know what landscape we're dealing with post-COVID, we will develop a statement of licensing policy that is fit for purpose based on what we find post-COVID. So that's what they're doing now. So even though their statement of licensing policy is only less than 2 years old, they're developing a new one to put in its place to be fit for purpose with the current situation that we're finding ourselves in. So innovations like that, I think, are really, really welcomed. We also have examples here where City of London, for example, they've got an award-winning noise policy, and I like this. It was to manage the unique acoustic environment of the area. So they've got some very, very quiet areas, some very loud areas, and so they looked at how they sort of developed a noise policy to cater for all those different spectrum. The London Borough of Hillingdon are developing a business-friendly street trading policy. I imagine that might already be out. If not, is very close to coming out. So I need to have another look to see if I can pick that up. But I think the general theme that we found from speaking to local authorities is that they are starting to think about how do we adjust these policies that businesses have to adhere to make them as as diplomatic and as business supportive as we can, but while still achieving what we need to achieve with it. Obviously, one of the things I put on there, or Ali and I have put on there, is that this happened with a lot of local authorities. A lot of local authorities have chosen not to renew their cumulative impact zones, which is where they identify an area where the onus is switched slightly. So when you apply for a alcohol license in most local authority areas that don't have, or all local authority areas that don't have a cumulative impact zone, you apply, and the obligation is on the local authority. If they feel that the application is not suitable, the obligation is on them to prove that your business would put one of the 4 licensing objectives at risk, would not uphold the licensing objectives. So that's the position if you don't have a cumulative impact zone. If you do have one, it's for the business to prove that they will support the 4 licensing objectives and not, sort of not put those at risk through their business opening up. So kind of just the onus has changed a bit through that application process. And we've seen lots of local authorities around the country remove those cumulative impact zones. And one of the reasons for that, and this I'm slightly skeptical, I have to say, because there is a burden of proof to bringing in a cumulative impact zone. So you have to show that there's evidential proof that this area needs this cumulative impact zone. Well, let's think about it. Over the last couple of years, has the level of crime, the direction of travel of the crime figures through COVID obviously went hugely down. So there was no evidence to uphold to retain cumulative impact zones or introduce any new ones. So that's why I think a lot of them have gone. And also to support businesses, but where it was the former and not the latter for the reason why they lapsed or they were removed, I think we're going to start seeing them being brought back in again in some of those areas. And in fact, is it the London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham, I think, has brought one of theirs back in again. So yeah, I think that picture might start changing in the other direction again soon, is my slightly skeptical take on that. Ali, I'm sure, has have a view on that.
Yeah, I think some will come back in. I think also working with some licensing authorities, and this picks up on the London Borough of Southwark little case study that we've got there, who are emblematic of I don't know, maybe a quarter authorities who are really starting to think, how do we, regardless if we've got restrictions like a cumulative impact area, how do we say what we want in terms of a licensed and hospitality economy in our town, in our city, in our neighborhoods? What do we want? Where do we want it? We consult with our partners on it. You know, we probably don't want loads of fast food outlets open at past midnight, right? We know they can be a flashpoint for violence. So we probably don't want to prioritize those. Every case in licensing law has to be taken on its own merits, but that's one thing. I think the other thing is that they'll say, well, you know, where do we want to develop, and trying to tie this in with planning and regeneration processes. What do we want in this part of town? What do we want in that part of town? Will our committee look favorably on your application if it's of a restaurant or a late night bar that's looking to attract an older clientele in this particular part of our town or city centre? And I think that proactive policy is starting to approach is starting to filter through on some policies in England and Wales. I think I've got an interesting observation just about to start some work in Dublin, and obviously been on the Purple Flag panel, assessment panel, so we see all the great applications coming through from our colleagues over in the North and the Republic. Is what I've found is how you need this sort of almost seismic moment to change, and in some ways, as you said, Sylvia and OJ, with the outside dining, and as a result of the pandemic, it sort of did what the Licensing Act in England and Wales was supposed to do 15 years ago in about 6 months, right? And I think in the Republic of Ireland, in terms of that review that you mentioned, OJ, that the government's now doing, you know, the licensing laws are hugely outdated in the Republic, and they're having, and our colleagues are here on today, will be able to perhaps comment on that, having a sort of Damascene moment where we go, wow, yeah, we're not really helping at all here. In fact, we're hindering. And so, you know, while we're trying to refine policies perhaps in England, Wales and Scotland that have been in for quite some time, the public has that opportunity to be, and it's happening in Northern Ireland as well, that opportunity to really think through what is it as a policy that we need nationally and at city and local authority level to support our evening and nighttime economy. And obviously there's lots of players in there, and it's a contested space because of safety and well-being, alcohol, drugs, and those sorts of things. But I do think that some of the examples that we use in here, Sylvia, have shown how through licensing, it's not simply about a reactive, regulatory, restrictive, computer says no approach. It's an approach which is, what do we welcome? What do we want our town or city to look and feel like in the evening and at night? And the licensing policy is one way to try and achieve that.
Thanks, Ali. I've just realised the time, so I'm going to wrap this slide in with my final thought slide, because everything that's on here I put in this one here. So because I need to hand back to OJ in a second. So yeah, the previous slide was about sort of some of the national changes, but I thought, having prepared this presentation, there were a few thoughts that I pulled out of the work that I'll just quickly go through. So I think one of the things that really came to fore through the work was the disparity that we saw in different local authorities. So, for example, I mentioned earlier, you know, the level of pre-application support, and oh, hang on a minute. So I was trying to look at I can't see what my notes say because I've got something in the way. It's guidance to existing operators. Yes, that's right. So level of pre-application support and guidance for existing operators varied hugely. You know, some was paid for, some was free, whatever. You know, so actually taking, I think that probably sets some. If you're an operator looking at maybe 2 or 3 different areas, it might make you make a decision. And again, with the statement of licensing policy, if one's more permissive than the other, it might make you make a decision to set up in one area, not another. So I think those disparities can have a challenging impact on the, you know, decisions. The approach of different authorities. So, you know, whether they approach things as a full variation, which is much more of a pain than doing a minor variation. We've also seen a lot of local authorities saying, you know, our high street's fine, it's recovering fine, we're getting loads of applications through, and we're having to say to them, actually, it's not about the new applications coming through. Those people might not have financial problems and whatever else because they're new operators coming in with fresh balance sheets, etc. It's the ones that have been like that fared through COVID, that they should be your yardstick of how your high street's doing. So trying to refocus people's observations and their, you know, sort of metrics and KPIs in terms of how their businesses are doing on the existing operators. Whether a local authority has a supportive approach versus catching you out approach. We're seeing much more of the former than the latter, but you do get still people get that kind of, you know, come along with their clipboards once someone's opened and pick fault rather than trying to help them to get it right in the first place. Another thing we found was that the government set fees nationally for licensing. So if you're City of Westminster and you're getting X number of pounds for, you know, to process a licensing application, that's more challenging for that authority to manage than a sort of small village, you know, based sort of local authority, or sort of, you know, small kind of a rural based local authority that might not have the same staff costs and other costs, and, you know, so that can be difficult. Local authorities having to deal with changes in legislation, which just adds to the day job. So actually, you know, they're getting more and more things to have to deal with. So for example, the pavement licensing changes that are coming through and having to, you know, that's just something they have to deal with as alongside all the other things they're doing to support business. Different levels of innovation that we're seeing in different authorities, that can be a personality driven thing. Some people are much more motivated to try and do things better. Some just like to sort of sit in the status quo, and that kind of came through. Staff shortages are affecting them too. So we're getting lots of licensing officers that long-standing leaving, retiring. Environmental health officers, a lot of them are going into private consultancy because obviously they got a lot of work through COVID and beyond. They now have had that kind of opportunity opened up to them. So we're seeing a lot of environmental health officers leaving and going and setting up their own practices or working for some of the big you know, companies that do consultancy work. And then, yeah, what have we got coming around the corner? Public sector cuts. So I would imagine in the future, what impact is that going to have on licensing teams? OJ mentioned change of use, retail to residential, you know, leisure to residential, retail to residential. Yes, through the planning phases, they can plan for things like noise. But my concern is that once the development's done, the developer buggers off, and you've got, you know, people sort of living in these buildings. By hook or by crook, at some point, that's going to translate into a noise problem. And then how is that dealt with going down the line? Yes, it should have been the developer's responsibility, but because it's not actually set in any kind of formal legal process, I think it does tend to still land in the lap of the noise emitting business in terms of having to try and deal with the noise. One of a number of challenges. But yeah, I'm going to hand back to OJ because I know that we're short on time. So yeah, questions and back to OJ.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Sylvia. That's amazing. There's so much detail in there, and there's so many potential areas of really good practice, which I think for other places looking for ideas to help make things easier. I think there's things there we can learn from. There's things there we can take forward. You know, I'd be interested to hear from others which of those schemes you would want to hear more about in the future. You know, I'm just making notes, whether it's the planning and licensing co-location in Coventry, for example, or the Horsham hospitality skills buffet, the nighttime investment zone in, I think it was Waltham Forest, which we had heard about, but you know, things like that would be great to hear more of. Or even the investment in dedicated spaces for delivery drivers, which I know is a bugbear for all areas, and it's both in relation to daytime and nighttime economy, and what level of onus there is on those delivery companies to contribute, as well as probably some of the hospitality businesses that benefit most from the logistics industry. So there's lots of food for thought there. I'm going to throw a question at you, Ali and Sylvia. Of all those schemes, which one do you think has made the most positive impact to the local businesses, if I was to force you to pick a favorite?
Well, I'll say age before beauty, so I'll go to Ali.
Oh, yeah, it's difficult. Well, one thing I would say is that most of them, and this is our constant bugbear as well, which is, you know, how do you evaluate them? Are you collecting good data? Something we always talk about purple flag applications is how do we know that they're having an impact? What are businesses saying about them? And, you know, one of the things that you know came out of our research is, yes, there's lots of great practice around local authorities trying to support businesses, but then businesses, you know, you speak to them, often they've got gripes, you know, for sure. And you know, we might say this is a great authority doing this, and then it's very easy to find someone saying, actually, you know, my tables and chairs, they wouldn't let me put them out for this reason, that reason. I thought it was, do you know what I mean? You end up in that scenario. But I suppose I do think Kensington and Chelsea is good because it's you know, it's not a peculiar borough in some ways. It's so wealthy in some places, and then obviously it's less wealthy in other. Social housing, obviously Grenfell is within that borough. I think what they thought was, we don't want to encourage outdoor dining at a strategic policy level, right? Because residents will complain. And then when they were forced to do it, and they did a really good job of it, the number of complaints was pretty low. And then they actually took quite a robust approach with residents, saying, you know, we'll try and solve the problems as Sylvia set out as best we can, even down to the beeping of refuse trucks arriving and clearing stuff and ensuring that tables and chairs were out at the time at which access could be, you know, all of that stuff micromanaged in some ways. The level of detail is superb there. But then it emboldened them to say, we're going to do this across the whole of our plan for the borough, and we're going to embed it in the physical regeneration and development of our borough. And I think that's why I find that the most impressive example.
That is a really impressive example, and I have to say I do like it. Reminds me a little bit to some extent, and I think this was in there as well in your slide, Sylvia, is Liverpool Without Walls, where because such a good job was done initially, it's emboldened the key partners to think, we got a chance of making this permanent. We got a chance of making this work. So maybe this is it now. The streetscape is going to change. So I like it. I think I'd agree with you, Ali.
Yeah, just to say the importance of leadership, Sylvia, as well, there was that the lead member for public space planning regeneration said, I want this to happen.
Yeah.
So having him, a very senior Conservative politician on a well-respected authority, saying, I want this to happen and we must make it happen, meant that percolated down through officers and they made it happen. And the circle was, you know, completed in terms of that process. That would not have happened without him saying, make it happen.
I would agree. And I think in terms of one project that was rolled out, you know, really broadly across a local authority area, as an example, is that would be mine too. But in terms of a local authority that's done a lot of different things, and again, they appeared in one of our webinars for this project, and I would absolutely recommend that you go and watch Rachel Pye from the City of London. It's a 10-minute clip, but the breadth of things they've done, the noise policy I mentioned, they trained their councillors, they're the ones that implemented the really permissive statement of licensing policy. The head of regulatory services there is having a lot of pressure to bring in a cumulative impact zone, but she's really kind of staving that off and using whatever power she can to say, look, let's just wait, let's hold off on that. Let's try and manage it through these different things. Pre-application advice free of charge. Safety First, which is a Best Buy On style initiative to support businesses. Just the breadth of things they do through that local authorities is very, very impressive.
Bro, thank you very much. And that, you know, that reminds me that this guy, I can't remember which area it was, but the training of elected members as well, to help provide that political leadership, which can allow for good decisions to be made up top, and that for that to filter down. That for me seems really important. Bill asks the question of, will the slides be available? Yeah, we'll make the slides available, Bill, so no problem with that. So I think with time is up, so thank you very much, everyone. We'll get invite sorted for the next Purple Flag Forum. I hope you found it really useful. Any questions, comments, anything at all? I know we haven't had enough time for more debate, but send them my way. I'm more than happy to put you in touch with Sylvia. She's fantastic. She knows everything there is to know about everything when it comes to evening and nighttime economy. And Ali as well is fantastic, and is a big joy to have on our Purple Flag panel. So does support the driving forward of standards in Purple Flag, and quite often comes up with some of the best ideas as well. So thanks all. I hope to see you all soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.